Howdy, all of you delicious people. So I guess I could say that this is the last episode of Wandavision. Because reasonably, I assumed that this is going to be the last Wandavision episode. And man, do they just leave it off on a just man, did they just solve it all, right? Man, did they just solve everything? They left so many things just so solved in this last episode. I was like, man, I can't wait till there were so many things resolved in this episode, and we'd have someone come in and just show up on the very last episode and just resolve everything. So I can be brutally honest now about this show, with the assumption of this being the last episode. So this show altogether was the biggest waste of time in my life. This show was a waste of time. Really, in all brutal honesty, even the very last episode wasn't important enough to garner watching. Really, you have it to where this last episode, yeah, there might be some interesting things, but really it's just a lot of loose ends that otherwise had already been basically told to you earlier what had happened, and now you're just seeing them in basically visual form within this episode. Really, we have it to where reasonably this entire episode is This Is Your Life. Is a This Is Your Life Wanda episode. And this episode doesn't really go any lick of anywhere, even to the point of just revealing at the tail end of, and also there's end credit scenes at the end of this episode. But the bulk of the actual episode goes into a crappy way to end it, and like just to basically say, oh yeah, tune in next season because next season will actually be much more exciting than this first one was. Believe me, it won't. So we kind of get some origins of some characters in this episode, but mostly we're basically, a lot of this is just all like, man, thank God I watched this season. I really I really got so much out of this season that I can't believe how much stuff that I was just utterly excited about while I was riveted while watching the season, like going like this, like, I can't wait for this season. I can't wait for every episode. Like, to me, a lot of people is like, man, every episode is getting better and better. Like, to me, I'm like, I can't enjoy this season. This season went nowhere, and the last episode did nothing. The last episode did nothing for me. It just kind of felt like the last episode was just like, oh, well, if anything, anybody's going to tune in for the last episode, and we're going to give them nothing. The only thing that we're going to give them is a consolation prize for otherwise being a part of this tail end of this show. And there was no big thing of like people were like going and they were saying like, oh my God, is Doctor Strange going to show up in the last episode? Is Captain Marvel going to show up in the last episode? Is Blue Marvel going to show up in the last episode? Is anybody from the Avengers or from, are they gonna all show up? Is it all going to be just all of a sudden everybody's going to rush in and it's going to be like Civil War, or it's going to like, is it all of a sudden going to be choose a side episodes with all of a sudden all the mutants on one side and all of Avengers on one side. Is that how it's all gonna end? No. Nothing that showcased that this show was going to creep into a bigger, crazier story towards the tail end of this happened. Nothing happened to get me to be excited about this last episode. And so I think that's all that I have to say really about it. It's just what a waste this was. What a real and true and honest waste that this show was. Like, I'm sorry if people feel differently. I'm sorry if all brutal honesty, I hope no one dislikes this video just because I did not overall like the show. I think there was a lot of people that were complaining that the show was boring, and I agree. To the very last episode, I thought this show was boring, to be brutally honest. So, ultimately knowing full well, never watch another Marvel show again. It doesn't even matter if it's really going to be a seemingly solid show. Really go into a Marvel show nowadays with an extremely low bar. Even when it's going to come down to the Falcon and Winter Soldier show, lower your bar on that one. Evidently, the Loki show is going to come out in June, which lower my bar even further for that one. So, because, I don't know, I think it's just going to be a lot of just, like, every single episode is probably just going to be him in a certain time period, and, like, what wacky adventures can Loki get into, can get into things in certain time periods? Oh, isn't that going to be great? That's what I'm assuming is going to happen through every single one of those episodes. It's going to be Legends of Tomorrow all over again, but with a Marvel spin. And I think Falcon and Winter Soldier, what the heck is that going to be? Like, are they just going to do missions? Is it just going to be like a detective series that ultimately just isn't all that exciting? I'd like to be wrong, but when looking at it, I think this show will ultimately kind of test the waters of Disney going, oh crap, well, I guess people realized that WandaVision was kind of clickbaiting the whole entire time. Well, I guess the following shows, we really got to give them something. Because man was like Mandalorian Season 2, a giant clickbait to me. But everybody got really excited about the last episode. For this show, how could you even get excited about the last episode? How can you get excited? So let's get excited about going into spoiler time for this one. Again, I want to apologize for reasonably just having the feelings of which I feel. I'm not sugarcoating this show anymore. Told me to say, oh yeah, there was some episodes that I think were good. Yeah, that was the bargain basement of good when looking at it. Because it's just like, oh yeah, this show actually got somewhere. Thank God. But then this last episode, goes nowhere. So, let's go into that spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we can spoil this episode. So, again, this episode is what should have been titled, This Is Your Life, Wanda. Because we ultimately have it to where in the very beginning, because this is called Previously On, this episode. So, reasonably, we have it to where we have to show the origin story of Agatha. And so we ultimately have it to where this girl is ultimately going to get burnt at the stake. But it seems that she eventually has all these witches around her that are going to burn her at the stake. But it seems like Agatha had been able to reverse the powers of these witches to otherwise drain the youth out of all of them. and so that just deems her to just be, hey, that's her origin story. So we have it to where Hagatha um, ends up telling us that it seems that Hagatha had put together a pony show to otherwise get Wanda to do the things that she's doing. We ultimately have it to where supposedly Pedro was a fake Pedro, ultimately knowing full well that Pedro's body is actually in a grave somewhere. Ultimately, all illusions and such. Like, it's good. It's a really good thing that ultimately Spectrum had that tail ending scene at the end credit scene, because it went nowhere. It went nowhere, that scene. So we also end up having it to where we have to have Wanda going through the flashbacks of her life, showing us in visual form what had happened in the exact same story of Age of Ultron. So they recycled an entire story but gave us a little bit of subtext, or gave us a little bit of like, oh, hey, like, this is the reason why Wanda is seeing all this black and white TV shows, because evidently her and her family really love the retro TV shows. Because when looking at it full well, like, I know in like in other countries, like, a lot of the times they get kind of really behind on watching certain shows. Meaning, so like, if we're getting Wandavision, or if we're getting like, say, if America is getting like Mission Impossible 5 or whatever. Like, in other countries, they are just now getting the very first Mission Impossible movie and seeing it for the first time, and they're loving it, because ultimately they are just behind the eight ball on getting certain things sometimes. So, because some countries, like, they only have certain TV shows, or they only have certain movies or whatever that they can uh, let people allow to watch and stuff like that. So anything moving on. So we eventually have to play through the entire Age of Ultron story, where eventually we have it to where it seems like it seems like Wanda and her brother and her mother and father are kind of sitting together, all going and watching some Dick Van Dyke episode. And then ultimately we have it to where there's bombs going off, and the Stark bomb ends up going into uh, Wanda's place. So we end up having it to where Wanda is desperately wanting to use her magic, but we have it uh, to where Agatha pulls her back, saying it's like, well, you can't use your magic, you can't use it. So, because we end up having it to where Scarlet Witch ends up turning from old uh, Scarlet to now young Scarlet. So within these flashbacks. So pushing on. So now we have to showcase how exactly Wanda had gotten her powers. And ultimately we have it to where Wanda was, of course, a Hydra refugee, and so ultimately she was to go and see Loki's staff, which ultimately had the stone on it, and we ultimately seemingly got it to where ultimately the guys that are testing this stone on people ultimately said, yeah, there's not a lot of people that survive from being close to this stone. We end up having Wanda walk in. The stone ultimately looks at her, and she looks at the stone, and then Wanda ends up walking off. Great. So So now we have to push even more forward, and we have to push even more forward, and we have it to where Wanda is coming back from being blipped or from being, snapped away. We are ultimately to find that ultimately Wanda is going to the Agents of S.W.O.R.D. headquarters and ultimately mentioning, like, hey, I'm back. Now I want to bury my husband. And we ultimately have it to where Wanda ends up forcing her way into the facility and ultimately seeing Vision's body ripped and torn apart, because ultimately this is a very high-end vibranium and whatever, and so ultimately they aren't just gonna bury what is to be Vision. They're gonna try to reuse it or recycle it or whatever. Of course, Wanda doesn't like this, and so ultimately she ends up breaking the glass and trying to ends up trying to touch Vision, and ultimately she cannot feel Vision within being in this within this environment. So we end up having it to where supposedly Wanda ends up leaving. But I guess she probably ends up stealing the body later anyways. So we ultimately have it to where seemingly all the loose ends are pretty much covered. We end up having it to where also Wanda ends up eventually going to her way to Westview, and we can kind of show every little bit of things leading up to ultimately the pilot episode, where ultimately they are to our Vision, to our Wanda uses her power exceedingly to turn this whole entire town black and white, and ultimately we now have the very tail end of the pilot episode where both Vision and Scarlet are sitting on the couch together and watching TV, basically. So we end up having a lead up to every single moment that is leading them up to what is going on now. So ultimately, we have it to where Hagatha is basically telling Wanda that Wanda basically needs to do everything that she says, because reasonably Hagatha has her kids held hostage. So we end up having it to where Hagatha ends up uh, going out into the street, to where ultimately we find that Hagatha is using her powers to ultimately seemingly, in a Doctor Strange way, choking both Wiccan and Speed. And they're never called that in this episode, but I'm going to call them that anyways. So we end up having it that this entire season has been led up to one thing and one thing only. And it's not an appearance of Doctor Strange, it's not an appearance of Captain Marvel, it's not even a reappearance of Spectrum or Geraldine or Rambo that ultimately was in the other episodes. The entire season after this whole, like, it's a wonderful life, it's your life, sucks to be you if your life wasn't perfect, we ultimately have it to where this whole season is led up to have Wanda be given her code name, which is Scarlet Witch. And then the season ends. Wow. Wow. Just boatloads of wow. You got jack crap nothing out of this entire season. There was no big ending. There was no, like, hey, the X-Men are coming. There was no there was no, like, real, like, Scarlet Witch didn't kill Agatha. No, it ends with basically Agatha torturing Wanda's kids, and to lead up to where there is going to be a fight, I guess, in the beginning of the next season. If there's going to be a next season, which I couldn't justify there being a next season in my mind to care to watch. But I don't know. I guess reasonably, if there's nothing else on, it's not gonna be. It's not gonna be a season that's gonna get better. It's gonna get worse. But yeah, so we did have a end credit scene, and I will ultimately talk about that. So the end credit scene is basically just them putting Vision 2.0 together with seemingly another resource other than the seemingly Mind Stone. It seems that ultimately they are kind of using some kind of other approach to put another Vision 2.0 together, because this Vision looks white. It looks painted white. It's kind of weird looking. So I'm assessing that this is probably a Vision that is probably going to be working with Sword to ultimately get it to where he's probably just going to be taking down both Agatha and Wanda at this whole entire time. Like, he's probably just going to be on his own kind of thing. And so we'll see what happens with that. So that's all that really happens within this last episode. Immediately what comes to mind is just, like, we've already heard all of these stories that are covered into this episode. We have also had an ending to this that ultimately doesn't resolve a lick of anything. And even a cutscene just kind of pushes the fact that, like, basically the end of this episode and the cutscene really just says, like, hey, we're going to do probably more interesting things in the next season instead of this. But I think reasonably even the next season, it's probably going to cut away to just be like, oh, well, yeah, Agatha and Wanda didn't really battle. It's just, like, here's the resolution to all that. And it's Wanda standing strong, knowing full well that she is now the Scarlet Witch. We have it at some point that ultimately Scarlet Witch had quasi-seen maybe some kind of design of what she was to look like. But when really looking at it, it was just completely a darkened thing that you couldn't see. It was like a shadow of what Vision or what Scarlet Witch could look like if ultimately she fully fledgedly embraced the whole Scarlet Witch costume of sorts. But yeah, so that's all that happened. That's all that happened, and I'm godsmacked and shocked about that. I'm like, wow, this has got to be the, like, if anything, I've had so many shows that would never give so many just cliffhangers or just give us nothing. But again, I think some people might also feel differently, that it's like, oh no, like, I actually liked this episode. Like, to me, I was trying to find some good in this episode, but I was just like, this episode is yet another, like, 8 episodes have been all throwaways. 8 episodes have been something that I haven't need to see. So when eventually we actually do get the Marvel movies coming back into fray, I don't think that I will ever need to watch any of these Marvel shows, to understand what is going on in the MCU. I just don't. And once I will be seeing a Marvel movie anywhere and it will have no ties to these shows, to where I'm just like, oh, well, hey, that was great that I saw this once and wasted time, because ultimately I assumed that the shows were going to be tied to the movies, but they probably won't be. Um, but yeah, so that is my opinion on the ending of this first season. I am just wow. I'm just wow. There was like end of first season on a cliffhanger is the worst possible outcome to a show that had nothing going on. And recently, the writing on this felt so freaking lazy for the last episode. Even though it could be interesting to any number of people, I just thought it was lazy. I really did. So, that's all that I wanted to say for this last episode. I am going to get out of here because there's not much to really say about this one, as well as any number of these episodes. Like, everything is so quickly to just, like, wrap these up because these episodes are nothing. So, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.